Hello everyone and welcome to the 23rd episode of Japanese Phonetics by Dogen. In this episode we will be wrapping up verbs, covering compounds, conjugation, advice, and exceptions, and also looking back at what we've studied thus far. Let's begin this lesson with some compound verbs, such as hikidasu, kakikomu, and nagetsukeru. Now there are a whole bunch of rules when it comes to compound verbs, such as atamadaka plus atamadaka equals pattern X, and heiban plus heiban equals pattern Y, but I've never really found these rules to be effective because it requires you to remember the pitch accent patterns for two independent verbs in the middle of a conversation, as well as how these verbs interact with each other when they become a compound. Furthermore, compound verbs are currently going through a phonetic shift, which makes it impractical for us to memorize a set of old rules. But what about this phonetic shift? Is there anything useful that we can use here? Yes. Much like how heiban I adjectives are shifting towards nakadaka, compound verbs are also shifting towards nakadaka. This is why if you look up many compound verbs in Japanese to Japanese dictionaries, you'll find multiple pitch accent listings. So it's very difficult to remember all of the rules for compounds mid-conversation, and compounds are currently trending towards nakadaka. I imagine you can see where this is going. That's correct. My go-to rule for compound verbs is nakadaka, with the downstep occurring on the second to last mora as it does in normal nakadaka verbs. For emphasis, let's look at the three example verbs one more time.
引き出す、引き出す、引き出す。書き込む、書き込む。書き込む。投げつける、投げつける、投げつける。
Compound verbs are nakadaka. By assuming this, you will immediately be able to say the overwhelming majority of compound verbs with what most Japanese speakers, primarily the younger generation, consider to be one of the correct pitch accent patterns. And while some linguists may have issues with this somewhat broad advice, I strongly believe that any potential phonetic negatives that come out of this are far outweighed by the positives. I'd like to end this bit by mentioning that these compound verbs will conjugate the same way as normal nakadaka verbs, minus a few rare exceptions. Okay, moving on to conjugation advice. By now we've thoroughly addressed the importance of not confusing the pitch accent patterns for heiban and nakadaka verbs. I'd like to add a little bit to this topic by talking about a related phenomenon that I've struggled with in the past. If you're a native English speaker, there's a very high probability that you will master not only the dictionary form of nakadaka verbs, but also the various conjugations of nakadaka verbs before you master the various conjugations of heiban verbs. It's important to avoid mapping the pitch accent patterns for these conjugations, particularly the past form, onto similar conjugations for heiban verbs. Many intermediate and advanced Japanese learners mistakenly do this and establish a habit that becomes very difficult to break later on. In other words, after a bit of study, you're likely to know by instinct that the past form of taberu is tabeta.
食べる、食べる。食べた、食べた。
Make sure you don't start saying the past form of heiban verbs such as kieru the same way. The past form of kieru is not kieta, but kieta.
消える、消える、消える。消えた、消えた、消えた。消えた、消えた、消えた。
Likewise, while the past form of shimeru is shimeta, the past form of akeru is not aketa, but aketa.
開ける、開ける、開ける。開けた、開けた、開けた。開けた、開けた、開けた。
Remember, most heibang conjugations are also heibang. Try to be extra aware of this. You should start noticing it immediately in conversation and in turn save yourself a lot of time in the long run. Okay, let's talk a little bit about exceptions. There is one main point I'd like to address here, and it has to deal with the intransitive-transitive rule. As you know, nearly all intransitive-transitive pairs belong to the same pitch accent family. Aku and akeru are both heibang, while shimaru and shimeru are both nakadaka.
開く、開く、開く、開ける、開ける、開ける、閉まる、閉まる、閉まる、閉める、閉める、閉める。
There is one exception to this rule that shows up in everyday conversation, and that is hairu and ireru. Hairu is atamadaka and ireru is heibang.
入る、入る、入る、入れる、入れる、入れる。
Finally, I'd like to end this lesson by talking a little bit more about my own personal experiences learning verbs. Up until this point, I've tried to be quite comprehensive, giving almost equal emphasis to both the major and minor rules, as well as the various conjugations. That said, I believe that it is the major rules and one particular conjugation that makes the largest impact on your spoken Japanese. I'd like to take a minute to readdress these now. Number one, the universal rule. The mas, sen, yo, and tai conjugations are the same for all verbs.
食べます、食べます、食べます。食べません、食べません、食べません。食べよう、食べよう、食べよう。食べたい、食べたい、食べたい。
Number two, the heibang verb rule. Most heibang conjugations are also heibang.
止める、止める、止める。止めた、止めた、止めた。止めない、止めない、止めない。
Number three, the atamadaka verbs rule. Besides the negative conjugations, atamadaka verbs are generally atamadaka.
入らない、入らない、入らない。入らなかった、入らなかった、入らなかった。入る、入る、入る。入った、入った、入った。
Number four, nakadaka verbs are a little bit more complicated, which leads me into the one particular conjugation that I mentioned earlier. This is the past form. The past form is not only extremely common, reason enough to memorize it by itself, but in atamadaka and nakadaka verbs, it actually shares a very similar pitch accent pattern to other conjugations as well. For example, the te form always has the same pitch accent as the past form, and the even if temo and such as tari forms are essentially the past form and the te form with suffixes.
食べた、食べた、食べた。食べて、食べて、食べて。食べても、食べても、食べても。 食べたり、食べたり、食べたり。
In other words, by memorizing the pitch accent for the past form, we automatically know the pitch accent patterns for several other forms as well. While this isn't particularly useful for atamadaka verbs in which all of these conjugations are atamadaka, it's very useful for nakadaka verbs in which there are many pitch accent rules. Thus, if you're quite pressed for time and maybe you feel a little bit overwhelmed by all the different groups I introduced in the previous nakadaka lesson, I would suggest memorizing the pitch accent pattern for the past form of nakadaka verbs alone. Just for reference, in nakadaka verbs, the downstep occurs 3 mora from the end of the word. Concentrating on this rule might be a good option. Okay, let's get into the summary for today's lesson. Number 1. Assume that compound verbs are nakadaka, but realize that this is a little bit broad advice as it accounts for the current phonetic shift that is happening with compound verbs. Number 2, make sure that you're saying not only the dictionary form, but also the various conjugated forms of heibang verbs with the correct pitch accent. Don't fall into the easy trap of mapping the pitch accent pattern for the past form of nakadaka verbs onto the past form of heibang verbs. Number 3, haeru, ireru is the major exception to the intransitive-transitive rule. And number 4, while some people prefer to concentrate on every rule and exception, in my own experience, I found it to be more effective to concentrate on the macro. Remember that the mas, sen, yo, and tai conjugations are universal, that heibang verbs are generally heibang, that atamadaka verbs besides their negative conjugations are generally atamadaka, and that for the more complicated nakadaka verbs, it may be beneficial to concentrate on the past form alone. Again, for reference, the downstep for the past form of nakadaka verbs occurs in the 3rd to last mora of the word. Okay guys, that's all for this lesson. I hope that you found it useful. In the next lesson, we will be testing our knowledge of the series thus far with another examination. As always, if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to comment below. Thank you very much for the continued support, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.